English Spirituality and Mysticism. In this opening lecture, we will discuss what we mean when we talk about spirituality, and what we mean when we talk about spiritual practice, and what we mean when we talk about mysticism. So we will begin by discussing spirituality. What is spirituality? And this is a term that we hear used all the time. There's spirituality sections in bookstores, and you'll see a wide variety of books in that section. You'll see self-help books, you'll see astrology, you'll see tarot decks, and some Christian texts, some Christian fiction, all kinds of things. This is a very broad, comprehensive term. And it's often used today by young people, maybe Gen Xers and some millennials, who say that they are spiritual but not religious. And some people like to offer the retort that they are religious but not spiritual. One of my seminary professors used to say that as a joke. I think it's an important term for us to use and to be able to define as we use it, especially in this course that I call a spirituality course. And as I myself have a degree in Christian spirituality, I think it's important for us to be aware of the history of this term and how it is being used today by scholars. So let's first begin with the term itself, spirituality, and the history of that word. The root of the word spirituality is obviously spirit, and the Hebrew for spirit is the word ruach, which is transliterated here. In Hebrew, it's just three letters, resh, vav, and chet. And this word means breath and spirit and wind. It's the same word for these three different experiences. And so I invite us right now to just sit comfortably and take a nice deep breath. Breathe in. Hold the breath for a moment. Breathe out. Do that a couple times and just be aware of the life force moving through your body, moving through your lungs, moving up your trachea and into your mouth and out of your mouth. That is what the Hebrews understood as spirit, as the life force, the same force that they saw blowing through trees and causing waves and hovering over the primordial waters at the beginning of time in Genesis 1. That's the Hebrew understanding, which is very fleshy and very much based on the human experience. It's certainly very pre-Platonic. And then we get the word in Greek, pneuma, or pneumatikos, which is the adjective. And this is the term used by Greek philosophers, by Plato and Platonists and Neoplatonists. It's also the term used by St. Paul when he talks about the life of the Spirit, especially in Romans 8. And it is true that among some of the Platonists, the pneuma and the life of pneumatikos is a life that is diametrically opposed to a life of the flesh and life of matter. And some may argue that Paul uses it in that same way. And yet, the more I study Paul, the more I study Romans 8, he seems to be making a very clear distinction between these two ways of living, but it's not that the life of the Spirit is a life opposed to matter. It's a life that is committed to the Spirit that gives life to matter. It is a matter of allegiance. We can give our allegiance to the Spirit that enlivens our flesh, or to our flesh that without the Spirit is really just a corpse. Without our ruach moving through us, our bodies are corpses. But without our bodies, our ruach is just the wind. So we certainly need both. And then we arrive at a Latin term, which sounds much more like the English term as we use it today, spiritus. And this is actually the name of a journal of Christian spirituality scholars. And some of the editors and original editors of this journal were the initial architects of Christian spirituality as an academic discipline, which is a fairly recent academic discipline. And then the term starts being used in English literature. We see evidence in 14th century text by William Langland called Piers Plowman, in which he uses the word spirituality in the context of describing a bitter quarrel between friars and secular clergy. He writes as wrath, as a personification of wrath. I, wrath, walk with them and tell them of my books. Thus they speak of spirituality, who each despise one another, till they be both beggars, and by my spirituality live, or else all rich and ride about. So for Langland, the term refers to ecclesiastical properties, endowments, and tithes. And the clergy argue about these things until they end up with nothing and live by the spirituality of wrath, and by my spirituality live. So spirituality often referred to clergy, especially in 16th century. Sir Thomas More says the clergy are the chief of the spirituality. In 17th century, the term begins to be used in the more modern sense as reference to a personal and affective relationship with God. And I'll just point out that in 12th, 13th century, especially among the scholastics, the term was also used and used in somewhat of a more Platonic dualistic sense as a reference to that which is opposed to matter. So Thomas Aquinas would sometimes use it in that sense. Richard Baxter, an English Puritan, said, maintain a constant delight in God and a seriousness and spirituality in all worship. And then Jeremy Taylor, the Shakespeare of the Caroline Divines, said, we eat his body spiritually. Now, after Vatican II in the 1960s, the term spirituality began to replace subject titles such as ascetical theology and mystical theology, and schools and seminaries began to offer courses in spirituality, such as this course. And GTU offers master degree programs and PhD programs in Christian spirituality as well. And definitions of spirituality have recently been offered by several major theologians, such as former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who says spirituality is each believer making his or her own that engagement with the questioning of the heart of faith, which is so evident in the classical documents of Christian belief. Rowan Williams also says that Scripture is the record of an encounter and a contest. Often in thinking about Scripture, we may be more helped by reflecting on the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel than by any images of oracles from heaven. As somebody with some Jewish background, I especially appreciate this understanding of the tensions and the arguments within our classical documents of Christian belief, post sacred Scripture, but also within Scripture itself. We see tension all throughout Scripture itself. And Scripture is evidence of many spiritualities coming to expression in the midst of tension. And we are invited into that tension to engage and participate in that wrestling and questioning. We are, after all, the spiritual descendants of Israel, which means wrestling with God. Bernard McGinn, a major scholar of Christian spirituality, says Christian spirituality is the lived experience of the Christian belief in both its general and more specialized forms. It is possible to distinguish spirituality from doctrine in that it concentrates not on faith itself, but on the reaction that faith arouses in religious consciousness and practice. So it's this distinction between dogma and doctrine, which tends to be the subject of theology, systematic theology and philosophy, as opposed to the lived experience of Christians throughout history and the lived experiences of Christians today, of you and of our communities. Sandra Schneiders, who is considered the primary architect of Christian spirituality as an academic discipline, also a fantastic Johannine scholar and one of my heroes, offers this helpful definition that tries to be as comprehensive as possible. Spirituality is the experience of conscious involvement in the project of life integration through self-transcendence toward the horizon of the ultimate value that one perceives. Spirituality is the experience of conscious involvement in the project of life integration through self-transcendence toward the horizon of the ultimate value one perceives. So in Christian spirituality, the ultimate value is, as Sandra would say, the Paschal mystery, the triune God, union with the triune God. But this also allows for a Buddhist spirituality in which the ultimate value is nirvana, Hindu spirituality, a Jewish spirituality, as well as secular spirituality, a spirituality of bicycling, or cooking, or swimming, or surfing, or dancing. This definition allows for many spiritualities, and I think it's helpful. And yet it also has boundaries. It must be something that is involved with integration, in the sense it must be life-giving. It can't be death-dealing. It can't be destructive for the sake of being destructive. And it must lead to something beyond the self, self-transcendent. So a life of pure narcissism or evil or Satanism would not be a genuine spirituality. So I suggest that we use Sandra Snyder's definition throughout this course. Now, as an introduction to Christian spirituality as an academic discipline, I want to give a brief introduction to the Christian spirituality program as taught at the Graduate Theological Union, which boasts the leading Christian spirituality program in the world. The Christian spirituality area in which I received my PhD is an area rooted in Scripture. So there's a focus on biblical studies. We have to take a biblical studies exam. And tradition. So we have to take a very intense church history exam. While also utilizing outside disciplines. So it's very interdisciplinary. In order to study the lived experience of Christians, while also engaging other faith traditions. So it's also interfaith. Every student has to study one outside faith tradition. And acknowledging the self-implicating nature of the study. And that leads us to spiritual practice. Beth Liebert says, practice is the intentional and repeated bringing of one's lived spirituality into the various theaters of one's scholarly work and attending to what happens when one does. She also says, I do not mean that one can simply read one's self into the text. All the appropriate exegetical moves must occur, including establishing the accuracy of the text as it exists, the adequacy of any translation employed, the serious study of the context, the author, the author's community, the literary form, the reason that the author is writing this text as far as it can be ascertained, and the position and frame of reference of those to whom the text was addressed. So all of that work is important, and we will try to do that as best as we can. And it's not dismissing all that just to talk about myself and how I see myself in the text. That work goes alongside understanding the self-implicating nature of the text. What does this do to myself? And how do I see myself in this text? Simone Weil says, real study is transformative by nature. And I hope that our study of these texts will be transformative. Sandra Snyder says, as Socrates knew, one cannot wrestle with ultimate truth without becoming a different person. This is not a problem to be solved or a danger to be avoided, but an effect to be celebrated. So what is the purpose of spiritual practice? Is it transformation? If so, transformation into what? We use that term transformation all the time. Oh, this was very transformative. We often seem to imply that that means we are transformed into someone more mature and more magnanimous and integrated and whole and ultimately divine. St. Athanasius, the father of orthodoxy, said that God became human so that humans can become God. Ultimately, we are called into theosis, to deification, which we go through encounters, especially unitive encounters with God. And this leads us to our third component, which is mysticism. How do we define mysticism? We can define mysticism generally as an immediate, and by immediate I mean unmediated, experience of the divine. Eliminate the middleman. It is a direct experience of God, an experience of intimate union with God. And mystical language is often female and sexual. And why do you think that is? We see that especially in Bernard of Clairvaux, who's not within our English canon, although he certainly influences St. Aelred of Rievaulx, but he uses very feminine language and sexual language. We can understand the sexual aspect because that is the language of unity, unitive language. There's that famous sculpture of Teresa of Avila in Rome, in which she seems to be in sexual ecstasy while receiving a penetration from an angel. That was Bernini. Yes, Bernini. The scandalous Bernini. Female language makes sense in that, in general, the female is understood as the receptive one. And we receive from the divine. And yet, we also see some male language. We see especially male language in the Cloud of Unknowing. And maybe that's appropriate as well when we try to pierce and penetrate God by piercing through, shooting our arrows through the Cloud of Unknowing. In William James's famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he describes 4 qualities of mystical experience. The first quality is noetic, in that there's some element of knowledge or insight gained. The second element is ineffability. The experience is ineffable. It cannot really be talked about. We can try to talk about it, but words cannot really contain the experience. It's also transient. It's very short-lived. And then it is passive. It's the experience of something being done to oneself, which again makes sense why there's this language of receptivity. Receptivity to an outside force. So what is English spirituality and mysticism? We can say that spirituality is the experience of conscious involvement in the project of life integration through self-transcendence towards the ultimate value that one perceives, using Sandra Schneider's definition, which I recommend. We can talk about mysticism as the unmediated, direct experience of God, of union with God, that we can sometimes describe, although it's ineffable, we can describe sometimes in sexual terms. We talk about spiritual practice and how we bring our own experience into the reading of the text while also doing all the necessary exegetical work, understanding the historical context, the audience, the limitations of language, and so forth. But what is English spirituality and mysticism? That will be the subject of the next lecture.